So thank you for joining us. And for the viewers that are joining us, Professor Khan, Feroz Khan, is a former brigadier in the Pakistan Army with experience in combat action and command on active fronts on the line of control in Kashmir and Siachen Glacier and Afghanistan border. He has worked on numerous assignments in the United States, Europe, and Asia, served as Director Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs in Pakistan Strategic Plans Division, Joint Services Headquarters. Professor Khan has also been a key contributor in formulating Pakistan's security policies on nuclear and conventional arms control and strategic stability in South Asia. Brigadier Khan holds an MA International Relations from the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, and held a series of visiting fellowships at Stanford University, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Brookings Institute, and Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. He has taught courses as visiting faculty at the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad, and widely participated in international and national conferences on strategic issues. Professor Khan has also written famously his popular book, Eating Grass, The Making of the Pakistani Bomb. So welcome. We couldn't have a more relevant and apt guest on our channel. And thank you, Professor Khan, for joining us today. And I wanted to begin with asking you about what is your sense right now in terms of how do you think that Taliban taking over Kabul now, and Kabul president has just run off and US troops are withdrawing. First, I'm just going to ask you a general question as to, do you think that this is a good thing for anybody? I know that there are multiple opinions in Pakistan and US about this. In India, of course, everybody is a little bit, sort of surprised about how quickly Taliban took over. But in Pakistan, there has been mixed reviews, mixed reactions to this whole thing. You had some, retired generals who've been celebrating, saying this was inevitable. And then there are the more younger people saying this could be inviting the Taliban or just more radical forces into Pakistan. So what do you think, sir, who's this going to, what are going to be the cost and benefits to all of us in the region?
Well, I think it's the most burning question you've asked. And first of all, thank you so much for your very kind introduction. And I'm a very down-to-earth person, so I'm just going to talk to you in a very down-to-earth manner. So I think you put the question, your sort of last later part of your answer is pretty much the kind of answer. It's kind of a mixed feeling at the moment. And I'll tell you why that's the case, It's mixed because what has happened was inevitable. That's the only thing, Whether it was good for the world, I mean, if you want to ask my opinion, no, it's not good for the world. This is not the way that, an insurgency succeeds and overthrows a government which is believed to be a legitimate government. So this is not the way that any country would be happy about a situation where, a sort of alleged government has to really run away, in a way. Mm-hmm. What has happened is that everybody is really surprised that it had happened by August 15th, whereas the estimates were that at least it might take 5 to 6 months. And at a time when there was a negotiated settlement. It is even more disappointing because this agreement that the US forces withdrew, and they also withdrew very fast. I mean, for people of the Indian subcontinent, it's not a very good memory when the British left us after 200 years. You know that what happened at that time.
Yes.
So I don't think that, chaos is something that anybody, and particularly in that part of the world, anybody would be appreciating that. And particularly in this side of Afghanistan, this side of the subcontinent of Afghanistan border, it's been 40 years of war. And in 40 years of war, this place needs a breather. And we're not sure at this today, as we speak, the very day this has all happened and Kabul has been captured today. It's very, very uncertain. Uncertainty is the biggest, fear at the moment. So now, why I say mixed feeling? Let me give you a quote and I'll follow it up what you're saying.
Yes.
Why this was inevitable was that this was a war in which there was one side of the war, that is United States, that had unlimited firepower, unlimited resources, but very little patience. On the other side, they had very limited firepower, very limited resources, but they had unlimited patience.
Mm, mm,
So you can see that was the somebody had the time, the other one had the had the clock. So that's how it happened, and it was inevitable that it had happened. And it's kind of disappointing in the sense that US withdrew by dealing with them directly to withdraw their forces safely. And then they agreed, or sort of agreed, that they are not going to use the Afghan territory for counter-terror operations. They did not agree to ceasefire. They did not agree on any intra-Afghanistan dialogue, the process. Now,
mm.
if you leave these two, that was more like two selfish governments funding their own things and then leaving the rest of the people, in the limbo. So that is where it's a disappointing thing. And there's only hope that we can think that this kind of regime, whose track record 30 years back
Mm,
wasn't something, nobody wants to emulate that record.
mhm.
But the only redeeming thing is that this takeover has been relatively bloodless. So it has been, so far we've not seen bloodshed, uh, less violence in the process. So that's the only sliver of hope that they may be slightly different than previous ones.
So, Professor Khan, I keep hearing the word inevitable, especially from the Pakistan side, that this was inevitable. Why do you think that a lot of the powers that be in Pakistan feel that this was inevitable? Because it is true that there was a giant power like US there. It had some skeletal stuff, not a whole lot. But do you think that this word inevitable is somehow connected to anything? Does it have a theological meaning? Uh,
I mean, there's a historical context here. There are three consecutive centuries. The British in Afghanistan in 19th century, Soviets in 20th century, and then now we've seen the US and everything. And because we were involved here as professors, we are advising the government, like, don't do the mistakes previous people did. When they came in Afghanistan 2020 years back, that Soviet Union had just gone at that time, just about 12 to 10 years back. So
mhm,
we're saying, look, that's very fresh with their memory. Every tactics that the Afghan Taliban adopted to sort of fight the war with the Soviet, with the Americans, was exactly the same what they had done with the Soviet Union. Their fathers, Mujahideens in the 80s. It was no different. And the US came with a very inevitable means that they came with a very peculiar set of objectives that they would leave. Nobody had any doubt that US would leave one day. They were supposed to leave in 2014. They should have left by once Osama bin Laden was killed and that was over. The US
mhm.
should have gone there. They stayed back. So every government that came, even Trump administration said, "I'm leaving," and the Biden administration just rushed it. So
Yes.
I can go on a little bit of a more detail because why this is inevitable. Because what happened when the Trump administration came, they are not going too far back. They moved all the firepower and asset into Afghanistan in 2017 when the first year they came to power. And they thought that the kind of firepower, the kind of strategy they used in Middle East against the ISIS would now succeed with Afghanistan. And we said, look, I mean, you have had boots on ground in 2010. Now you're bringing the firepower. These people are the so
But let
there's
me
another
stop you. But Professor Khan, let me stop you there. So when you say firepower that was used for ISIS, do you think it was mostly air power that was used in the case of ISIS?
air power. They were
And
air
you
power.
think air power wouldn't have worked in Afghanistan, is it?
Well, it was working in Afghanistan to the extent that it was keeping the Ghani government in power. As you can see, what happened.
Yes.
It was air power. It was satellite-based intelligence. It was technology. It was drone. There was a lot more. I mean, the asset wasn't just one sliver, but there was a lot more. The whole apparatus had moved here. And in terms of killing and bloodshed, not much has been reported what happened between 2017 and 18. The
Mm-hmm.
problem was, and this is again a problem, was again the inevitability part.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Taliban would not count the body bags. To them, okay, you're done. The Americans would count the body bags. To them, I mean, the more you're killing, the more they're producing in the same process. So, I mean, that was how long can you keep on fighting that until you kill the whole ethnicity, a
Mm.
whole people. That was it. It was a point that there will be a point of no return, and they will frustrate this kind of. This is insurgency. This is a very classic insurgency. It cannot be fought in the same way. So
It
we said
cannot.
that what might have happened in Middle East may not happen. And when you talk about the retired community of Pakistan, I'm one of them, but I've been mostly here. But
Mm.
even I am aware that as far back as 2005 and 6, and I'm aware of that. And you know why I'm aware of that? Because President Musharraf was personally briefing George Bush and Dick Cheney, the vice president, that look, I mean, you cannot, I mean, Al Qaeda, and you have to begin to distinguish between the two. You will
Mhm.
need these forces to, unless you have negotiated settlement with the Taliban, you're
Mhm.
not going to defeat the Al Qaedas. So there's a different way of dealing with these people. And the only way to really eliminate that is to not start treating them as the enemy. But that's not what happened. The moment they started treating them, that whole thing completely changed, and that became a problem. And then it became a war across the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And then, the Pakistanis sitting in the middle, they had no other choice but to start hedging the bets with the process. And
But do you,
that's where geopolitics came into a different game. That's a second level. Now we are really talking inner level Afghanistan, but then there's a second layer of politics, which relates to India, Pakistan, and the other regional countries. They
Mhm.
they had a different layer of role to
That's
play in this.
that's true. But just to get back to the whole Al Qaeda, and you see, the U.S. agenda was to basically get rid of any terror-making kind of an ecosystem that had emerged in Afghanistan
Yes.
after the Soviets broke up. After Soviets left, there was a whole ecosystem that developed. But then, truth be told, America created, these sort of warrior factories, or the Taliban factories, which were churning out lots and lots of I think soldiers. And you are right that this how many can you kill, even if Taliban has not been counting body bags? How many can you kill? So are these? Do you think that these, and in the US, as you know, people here, New York Times and all, they refer to them as sort of as factories of fighters who are going to keep coming out from who knows, from Fatah or any of those border regions into Afghanistan. If that keeps happening, I mean, who is it going to benefit, right? I mean, do you still think that there is an obsession in Pakistani armed forces still with Kashmir? And if so, do you think that this whole, the volume of people going from this side into Afghanistan could have an impact on insurgency in Kashmir? And what do you think is what's the sort of the equation there?
Oh, okay. So now that's a different layer of question. It's kind of interrelated, but I'll explain it. You know what? So
Mm-hmm.
so first off, what happened there, that, as you know, that this whole tribal ecosystem, as you call it,
Mm-hmm.
this ecosystem obviously was created in the 80s, and they keep on producing that. And one thing that US, not just the Soviet Union left, but the US also abandoned. So
Yes.
now these very forces were used for Pakistan's own regional security objectives. They had their own national security, because if you're looking at the Pakistani, from the Pakistani perspective, if that's a question, then they see that somebody from a distant power comes in our neighborhood, uses them, and when their security objective is over, they leave, and then they leave the mess for them to clear.
Right.
It was coincidental. This is something our audience in India don't recall. Maybe they know it, but they don't recall it well. That the Kashmir uprising in 89, 90 just happened at the cusp when the one war was ending and the other was beginning.
Mm-hmm.
This war of 10 years of experience of betting insurgency in Kashmir was a much more different than it happened any time in 48 or 65 or any time before.
Can
Kashmir
you
was
tell
a
us more
dormant.
about that? Can you tell us more about that insurgency in Kashmir? What was that in 89, 90? I didn't
No,
know that.
so what happened was, okay, here's what happened. So you know that there was an uprising in 1948 that led to a war.
Sure.
Then there was
Yes.
the 65 war, which Pakistan tried to, use insurgency and a
Yes.
strategy to get Kashmir.
Correct.
And that strategy failed in Kashmir, and it began, India-Pakistan war happened. But pretty much from that time onwards, Kashmir was kind of on the back burner. Even Bangladesh war happened, but Kashmir was still on the back burner. Kashmir really came up on the radar before the Soviet Union had, almost in 1987, 88 elections, when the election happened, and that was that uprising that
I
happened.
didn't know that. I didn't know. It was an
So
uprising by who, though?
it was uprising within Kashmir as a
Okay.
result of rigged election in 1987. And they're
Okay.
very well recorded. So it
Mhm.
happened 87, 88, and that unrest in Kashmir continued till about 89, 90 time
Mhm.
frame.
Okay.
And that is the time frame, or this insurgency in Kashmir was, unprecedented in its indigenous nature, shall we put it, at that time. At the time when the insurgency happened, it was really unprecedented. Any Indian security forces would know that that was really huge. And that's the time, 89, 90, 91. You can see the world Cold War is ending, and it wasn't Kashmir alone at the time. If you, I mean, just historical fact, it was happening in entire Eastern Europe was going on. You can see Tiananmen Square incidents happening,
Yes.
Yugoslavia breaking up, and Soviet Union breaking up in the whole process. The whole East-West Europe was sort of breaking apart.
Correct.
And at the time, we forget, we go into the metrics of the time as to what was this insurgency like there. But at the local level, this experience from the Mujahideen experience of defeating a superpower in Afghanistan,
Yes.
that experience was then transformed into Kashmir.
Correct.
At the time. So it was, one was the timing of that insurgency, and second was the sophistication of the strategy that was done. And by the next 4 or 5 years, so if you go in the first 4 or 5 years, since you link the Afghanistan and Kashmir situation, I'm just looking at what happened between 89 and 1994. That's 5 years period, 6 years period. That's exactly the situation that was the peak of insurgency in Kashmir at that time. And that was the time there was a civil war in Afghanistan once the Soviet Union left.
Okay.
And, by the way, the destruction the Afghans did to themselves after the Soviets and the Americans left the region was much, much greater than the Soviet Union. The whole 10 years they did. They didn't destroy Kabul the way, Northern Alliance and the other forces did that.
Interesting.
The warlords. I mean,
warlords, yeah.
And it seems ironic now that once the Taliban took over Kabul around 96, 97, that time frame when they were taking over, there was absolute peace in Afghanistan. The problem was not violence at that time during the Taliban rule. The problem was it was the kind of regime that was appalling. I mean, in terms of we're looking 20th century, 20th, 21st century, and we have that kind of a regime that is, beheading people and beating up women and, not sending them, all those things that practices there. And the whole world is worried about that kind of practice in a 21st century nation state. So that was the problem. It wasn't the problem of violence and all that.
But do you think that so? But when so at what point was it really Al Qaeda which was responsible for 9/11, Dr. Khan?
Oh, of course, that's very well established. I'm not going to get into conspiracy theory. Yes, Al Qaeda did it.
It was okay.
Yes.
Okay,
Al
so
Qaeda did
in
it.
that, right? And
yes,
so in that, if it was Al Qaeda, then I think yes, it is true that then US wanted to go into Afghanistan, bomb them out, and things like that. But was that? In hindsight, do you think that was a sort of a wise strategy? Because Al Qaeda it has multiple, headquarters. It can locate anywhere.
No,
right?
I think, what happened after 9/11, the United States had the right to retribution and response. So I do not think that US going into Afghanistan was illegitimate. It had the international UN sanctions. It was the right war.
Okay.
I would disagree whether US needed to go in Iraq. That was totally not called for. That's separate in 2003.
True.
But for the US forces in 2000, after one, there was a genuine reason because Al-Qaeda, by the way, Al-Qaeda was also formed as a result of that ecosystem that you called, and they were the ones who were formed during the Soviet days. And now they were the ones who actually hit them with a different ideology and a very different motive. That motive essentially was that, the US is at war with Islam and they're occupying, that whole narrative, the whole 9/11 commission. I don't have to really go back that because there are conspiracy theories about that. But yes, I mean, Al-Qaeda was able to form the house in that kind of a mess that Afghanistan had. And and we go back to the very first question that you asked, this is the biggest fear now. The Taliban agreed with the American negotiator that they are not going to support any counter groups,
Right.
Then that, so it was kind of a counter-terror cooperation, which resulted for them to withdraw peacefully from Afghanistan. Now, that's the biggest fear, whether that was a tactical move on part of the Taliban or were they genuinely not having that. If the Al-Qaeda is kind of ineffective, but it's not eliminated completely. I mean, in this day and age, you can talk about, like if you're having an antibiotic for 4 days, so you don't have it for 2 days, you don't leave it there. Then it metastasizes and comes back. It is in that kind of a situation. We still don't know the successor of Osama bin Laden, al-Zawahiri. Where is he? Nobody talks about him. He's alive somewhere.
What's his name again?
Al-Zawahiri.
Okay.
The one who took over the Al-Qaeda leadership.
I see.
We don't know if he's alive or dead, but it's commonly believed that Al-Qaeda is sufficiently crippled enough to be as effective international terror organization as it was 20 years back. So in that sense, it's a reduced threat.
But do you think Al-Qaeda, even people like Al-Qaeda, are satisfied now that they have, do they still see any, I'm just trying to get into the mind of another party, which is, are they still sort of wanting to regroup and say, let's punish the West for Iraq and Bosnia? Or do you think that they'll change their mind about anything? Or are they still on track to saying, look, we're going to take over the world, we're going to Riyasat Medina kar denge, hum yahan se jayenge, wahan jayenge, we'll go through Kashmir and Syria. I just see this buzz on the internet, Professor Khan, and do you think that that's valid anymore? Would people really even buy into it? In the early days, at least there was some backing from Saudi Arabia and some of the Wahhabis, but do you think that kind of a, doctrinal ideology will still stick, and will it energize some of these groups again?
So let me answer some of the things. Yes, so this group would not change their ideology. It depends upon their capacity and capability. They would still think the same way you thought about it. But there's just a little correction that Al-Qaeda was not interested in the regional security, or, they don't care about self-determination and those things, They had a very different ideology, as you mentioned in your question, the Islamic Empire, and that, bringing the kind of a 1500 years old system, that kind of a thing, They could have damn about Kashmir. They could have damn about, I don't know about Palestine, they couldn't damn about that. They would care about Mindanao, where in Philippines, they would only use those places where these insurgencies are happening for liberation, their own liberation or their own things. They would just find and turn that movement into an ideological movement. Just Kashmir separation from India is not an ideological movement of what Al-Qaeda's viewpoint is. That is a very different context altogether.
But Professor Khan, if one is following the ideology of Al-Qaeda and sort of Riyasat al-Medina, in that there is a doctrinal kind of conversation going on, buzz going on, that it is only through Kashmir and Levant in Syria that there'll be this success of this ideology. Is that, there's almost a theological kind of conversation going on in certain groups about that. And do you think that people will still follow that kind of
No, that was your original question. I was coming back to that thing, that. So at the time, we talk about 20, 25 years back, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, they were financing. They are not in that position.
Yes.
That's one thing. Then many more countries have learned the lessons, what kind of people they are, what they were not, there are very lot of myths, I'm just trying to unmythify this, or they break that myth, about. It may or may not, it's too early to say, but I'm trying to say why it may not be the same. And we'll see what happens, I don't have a magic wand, but I'm giving you reasons,
Okay.
It was easier to link Kashmir and Afghanistan in the 90s. It may not be as easy now. And I'll tell you why. The funding sources are not there. The Pakistanis themselves are fearful about that the Taliban may now want to make half of Pakistan and like them. That is their biggest worry. Not about linking Afghanistan into Kashmir, because then what would happen to Pakistan itself?
Okay.
And most of the Indian authorship that I read here, they don't see one thing, or they know it but they don't write it, that this jihad enterprise has actually collapsed, and it has collapsed within Pakistan. Most Pakistanis also don't write that, by the way. That enterprise has collapsed inside Pakistan. Even if there was a time where the state could control, and that is collapsed because these organizations are never in any state's control. The state is in delusion that they can control them. Actually, they may control them for a while because these groups and forces need the state support for some time, but then they become independent enough to create mayhem. And then they become the problem to their own benefactor. And this has happened repeatedly. And even 9/11 is still the same, They're created by the same people whom they attacked,
Mm-hmm.
And so a large number of forces which the Pakistani sort of, security enterprise created,
Mm-hmm.
they came back and they killed them. They became the target. And how many
Interesting.
thousands and thousands have died? That's and this is not something. I'm talking as a professor now. This is not something that has happened to Pakistan that you surprised. This has happened historically. You go
Mm-hmm.
back thousands of years. This is what happens. You feed these forces, they're going to bite the same hand. This
Interesting.
is a very so now what has happened. So that's the sources are not there, but there's another important thing that has also happened. That may the
Mm-hmm.
consequences of 9/11 they've seen has happened, and the Taliban also began to realize that they to be a pariah status in the international system, you can't survive now. They want legitimacy now.
True.
If the question now for them is they are seeking legitimacy, and if they continue with that kind of behavior,
Hmm.
whether or not that legitimacy by the international community will be given to them or not.
Why would
Here
they
is
seek,
some
but sir, why would they seek legitimacy from the international community?
because they are a banned organization, they are a terror organization, their
Right.
finances are frozen, they cannot travel. You cannot run a country like that,
Mm.
like the way you ran. So,
Mm-hmm.
and they terribly need all those things, and that's
Mm-hmm.
what the US was promising them that look, I mean, if you don't do bloodshed, that's why they're not doing bloodshed.
Mm-hmm.
If you become a sort of a peaceful way of a political settlement in Afghanistan, we will recognize you, and
Mm-hmm.
when we recognize you, we will give you the sort of legitimacy that you need. And that was the reason. And they got legitimacy because the US directly dealt with them,
Right.
previous position. So
Mm.
once a superpower is dealing directly with a group without the involvement of the Afghan government, obviously they started feeling empowered now.
But do
So
you
and
think? But do you think China is substituting the U.S. now as sort of the deep-pocketed superpower that's going to be in the
uh,
region? Do you think that China could be incentivized, could be feeling incentivized to support the Taliban? They have been having conversations with the Taliban, um, and China is obviously a good partner of Pakistan. And do you think that there is that collaboration going on?
yeah, so in that sense, this Taliban is slightly different in the sense they have been in communication with the Russians,
Mhm.
also with India, by the way. They also tried India as well as China.
Okay.
And so they are much more different than the Mullah Omar's Taliban. From that sense, we can see the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not they've ideologically changed or this is tactical, this is something too early to say right now.
Oh,
We
interesting.
don't want to give any judgment, but we can see what is empirically, can be observable are these factors,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
they are not behaving in a certain way as of today. I'm talking to you on August 15th still, so
Yes.
we don't know where the pathway. We're trying to figure out what might be the prognosis in the future. Now about China, I mean, yes, they have negotiated with the Chinese, but Chinese interest is that it was writing on the wall, and the Chinese are now uh, in Pakistan for a very different reason. They have this Belt Road Initiative going on. They have this whole CPEC. They have the deep pockets now.
Right.
But the deep pocket is not free. The Chinese don't give money like that. They want access. They want connectivity. They have the biggest problem with the Chinese with the Taliban is not about. I mean, connectivity may or may happen because that has to happen with Pakistan, obviously. Uyghur problem, Xinjiang.
Right.
That is the China's biggest problem
Correct.
because these Uyghurs, when the Chinese crack down on them, they go and find refuge in Afghanistan and they join Taliban.
Right.
And many of the Uyghurs have been fighting alongside Taliban. So the biggest problem with the Chinese is about, that you don't do this mess, and probably the Taliban have assured that we are not going to do this. So much for the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way.
Right. Right. Right.
When the Chinese are killing the Uyghurs,
Yeah. I agree.
where is the Islamic Brotherhood now?
Right. Right.
They
No, but
don't even, yeah.
what do you think is the volume of Uyghur participation or support in the current Taliban?
No, very less, not as much because what's been going on that Uyghurs would come from Xinjiang into the Pakistani part and then they will go into the tribal areas and then they would not come back. So there's
Mhm.
a deeper history about that because the access of the Uyghurs to go to Makkah, Medina, or anywhere in the Muslim world, travel for pilgrimage and all, they would not go back to China. They would
Oh,
disappear,
interesting.
and This has been going on in the 90s.
Is that right?
Yeah. So,
But is it only the sort of the Uyghurs who are troublemakers that are disappearing into once they come through Pakistan and Fatah?
oh, no, it was not Uyghur. They were Chechens. They were in this part, in this 1980s, 90s, they were all. You must have heard another term called the Arab Afghan.
No, I
A lot
didn't.
of Arabs, yeah, the Arab Afghans were those Arab fighters who came in the 1980s. They fought against the Soviet Union and settled here. They got married, and then they have those children. So you have Arab father and Afghan mother, and many of them became Taliban. And then all these fighters that came in the 1980s,
Mm-hmm.
they never went back.
Mm.
There was another term I remember at the time. It was called stateless people.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
They don't belong to any state.
Correct.
Like they're Sudanese, they're Arab looking, they are Filipino looking, but we don't know that.
Right.
So
So
these were the people who eventually became all part of this organization, Al Qaeda.
that's right. But is Fatah becoming kind of the go-to place then for these stateless actors?
So now what happened was that Fatah, the military operation that the Pakistan military did for the last 10 years, kind of sanitized this area.
Mm-hmm.
And these people went in those parts. But
Mm.
a large number of these people who I'm talking about stateless, they then became part of the state because they married, they have children, they're old now. So they're
Yeah.
in their 60s and 70s. They're kind of retired community.
Mm-hmm.
But their kids and grandkids are the one who are now in their 20s or something. They are now moving out into this kind of a world. But so, and then the big changes that is happening is that Fatah is now no more. Fatah is absorbed with the Pakistani state now as part of the province. And then the fencing has been done now, almost 90% fencing. So a lot more has technologically changed.
Mm-hmm.
I go back to your question as to why the same would not happen. One is that their financing sources will be very reduced.
Mm-hmm.
Second is that, that it is not the 90s that, the experience has actually told them not to link Afghanistan with Kashmir.
Mm-hmm.
And the third, the biggest thing is that now the amount of technological changes that has happened, that's your word now. Satellites, intelligence, drones. It is not possible to do operations the way you could do it in the past. Now you could be very quickly picked up with telephone cells and all.
Right.
And that is a huge change. Technological change is the major factor
Mm-hmm.
why that war cannot be fought the same way. Now, if you go and fight with these guys,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to fight with their chappals and shalwar kameez, and they'll fight with the low-tech method.
Right.
And and the old system of signaling, and you won't be able to catch them. That's the only way you can do this. But insurgencies of tomorrow is going to be very significantly different than what it is today.
But do you think ideologically they are still powered by this idea that life begins after death?
Oh yeah,
Really?
yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean that. Oh, now we're getting into a very different thing, So
That's because that's different to fight. You see, that's different from fighting. You see, an army of robots fighting each other is a different story. So even if they were robots, right, which go into war with the Taliban, let's say, it's all very well. But if they are all going to be kind of, you see, what's missing in the Western equation is this whole idea that people could be willing to give up their lives quite willingly and be thinking that we are heading to heaven or some such thing. There could be a religious thing to this whole thing, and that equation is simply, that variable is not added to military strategy in the US.
Yeah, I mean, look, people have been waging insurgency for various sorts of reasons, and how do we explain the kamikazes? Why would the Japanese pilot be killing themselves?
Right.
How do we explain Vietnam for 7 years, say 10 years? What were the Viet Congs dying for? I mean, that wasn't any Islamic ideology with them.
Correct.
So obviously, I mean, if you're looking into those, what are the motives
Yes.
behind those who fight insurgency in this way?
Mm-hmm.
In this particular case, yes, I mean, they were motivated that there's a life hereafter,
Right.
and I go back to that question that somebody's counting the body back, the other one is not counting the body back, because they said, look, this is your mission, you die. The moment you die, you go to the heavens, you get your virgin there, and then your parents will be taken care here. We will take care of your parents. So don't worry about household and all.
Correct.
And this is in that part of the world, it's a big thing about, because I'm a son, if I'm giving my son for jihad, he's trained in the madrasas. Parents have given their children to the madrasas. They are trained there, they're motivated there, they're radicalized there, and they're turned into either suicide bomber or fighters.
Right.
And then that's the end of their life. So the
What
moment
age? What age do they start there, roughly?
in terms of suicide bomber, there were many teenagers. When Pakistani suicide happened, there were like thousands of suicide within Pakistan.
Right.
Those guys were very teenagers.
No, but what age do they start, Feroz?
Different ages, but usually it is teenage. They go to.
No, but they have to start early though, right? They have to start at age 3, 4, 5 to go into a seminary that's going to teach them the benefits of suicide bombing and so on.
Yeah, not 3, 4, 5, but usually they go. Some of the kids have said, look, they're people who have produced children.
Right.
They have produced children who are, like 5, 6 children. They don't know how to feed them.
Correct.
There's no family planning out there.
Right.
So they send them to mother sides, free education, free stay, free food. Everything is free for them.
Correct.
And then gradually they sort of, by the time they wrote them to Quran and other activities, and by the time they're 12, 13 years old, so obviously they don't send them into the battlefield until they are teenagers.
Sure.
So usually we have seen from anywhere from 14 till about 25 years of age people, and in many cases when there was a suicide, bombers were drugged.
Is that right?
Yeah, drugged. Once the Pakistan military carried out the operations in Fatah, and they found out those places. They found out, interviewing people, many of them who didn't explode, eventually were found that they were totally stoned completely.
But they were stoned with what though? Was it pot or something else?
Well, heroin, whatnot, they would all kind of, and that, and that's another subject, that this whole belt is a drug factory,
Yes.
So, and that's how the Taliban and others were sustaining, this part. So we are getting into another debate in this part. So how they were motivated was totally, was a very different factor, how these guys happened. But we did see that once those factories were eliminated in the Fatah areas, as you talked about, we don't have suicide bombers anymore in Pakistan. We don't hear about them. Here and there, one across, but imagine it was happening like 10 suicide bombing in a day. Hundreds of people are dying. 70,000 people have died within Pakistan. If not,
in
the
how
enterprise.
In how many years?
70,000 and about, I would say, from 2004 onwards. But more or less it started more later part of the decade, closer to 2009, 10, 11, that part. And then when the military operation started, then the soldiers started dying in the process. And the displacement, and we don't talk about people who are displaced, internally displaced people from these border areas. So we have had so much of instabilities in these border regions, tribal border regions, that was quasi ungoverned for a very, very long time. In fact, for hundreds of years, even British Empire was not as governed here in this part. And then, the series of wars that have happened, this is the result of all that. You mentioned a nice word, it's an ecosystem that existed in a geographical sense.
Professor Khan, do you think that does anybody in the Pakistani sort of military establishment have control of the situation? Do they feel that, so let's say if the Taliban in Afghanistan felt that they wanted to impose an Islamic, a tougher Islamic state in Pakistan through Fatah or something. And if they have Chinese backing, actually, worse still, do you think that they would be, does anybody in the Pakistan, military establishment have control on these people?
No. I think this is another myth,
Yes.
Why the hell would China want to invest in Pakistan if Pakistan has to become another Taliban kind of a country?
True.
That's just not true. The whole thing is that they thought these are the forces that can provide the strategic depth. Now we're getting into a different geopolitics here.
Right, right.
Because Afghanistan is a hostile space and creates a second front for, if you're talking about military strategy, that's what it was. To prevent Afghanistan becoming a second front. Because one front was India, and India, by the way, actively fermented to create the second front for Pakistan from the very beginning. I mean, let's call spade a spade. This was the whole thing.
Absolutely.
It has been going. And when India, Pakistan, then eventually, first of all, it was the Pashtunistan movement that, the Durrand line will not be accepted. And it's kind of an irony because just that issue India was supporting because partition happened and the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan became Pakistan-Afghan border. The British border of Afghanistan, the Durrand line, was not India's border.
Right.
If there were no partition, this would have been India's problem.
Correct.
How to deal with the border,
Yes, yeah.
So now you have a two-front situation for them. After the 1980s, the idea came at the time, I'm talking 30 years time, that there was something called strategic depth, which means that the hostile space of Afghanistan should not be allowed to be a stepping stone of hostile forces, namely India, particularly, that India may not create a second front. And therefore, if we support these forces, Mujahideen, whom we supported in the 80s, they're going to provide us a depth of the. Now, it was not a military concept that you're going to put your nuclear weapons or your aircrafts there. It was the idea was to deny space, not to use the space. But then what happened in that very space while that period was going on, that space, because these were the people who were so, clued up and so trained for counterinsurgencies, insurgencies, I apologize, that they could feed the Kashmir insurgency from there. So they became kind of training ground, not a ground for other military purposes, But the kind of Kashmir terrain insurgency is very different than the kind of terrain in Afghanistan. You can have the same tactics, but the operational environment is very different. The terrain is different, the landscape is different, the motivation is different. The Indian Army tactics in Kashmir is different than Afghanistan. So, it's very, sometimes people make a very, sort of a parallel to that.
Right.
It may look theoretically, but practically it's not the same. It's very different,
Right, right.
So that became the strategic depth part.
Okay.
Until the second myth is, and this is that the Taliban were in control of Pakistan. Now I know that I've been you've just read my resume.
Yes.
Even in the 1990s when I was still active, they were never in control. The Pakistanis tried their level best to persuade the Taliban not to destroy the Bamiyan Buddhas. You remember the big statues in the 2001?
Okay.
And they said, they just gave a middle finger to the Pakistanis and said, get off, you don't.
Where were these idols?
This was in a place called Bamiyan, in the heart of Hazara district in Afghanistan. And there were these huge statues. One of the times, that was I think it must have been 3,000-4,000 years old, And when the Taliban captured that part and they destroyed that, and the Japanese and the whole Buddhist world was, kind of saying, expecting the Pakistanis to put pressure on them, they don't do that. And they did, I know, they did their best to do that. And that was one example that, they said, hey, thank you for your support, but, don't try to teach me my fate.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're not in their control. When they can easily tell the Pakistanis, thank you very much. Now, that's the whole problem that, the Western world still believes that the Pakistanis have so much influence that they can force them to do the desired thing. They may do it to a certain extent, but not to the extent that, not to the extent that, they are very clever. They're very smart. They say, hey, not beyond this.
Does Pakistan, Professor Khan, does Pakistan want to, in your view, does Pakistan want to move from the current situation that it might be in right now into a more modern statehood where it really kind of starts focusing on economic growth and prosperity, and says, okay, enough of this, of kind of having any ideological impetus behind us and things like that. Do educated people like Imran Khan, for example, right? He's so westernized. I don't know how he is now, but he used to be quite westernized. Do you think that that's where a bulk of Pakistani establishment might be feeling the need to sort of say, no, look, Pakistani startups are doing so well, Professor Khan. I mean, these companies are having massive exits. The technology guys in Pakistan are people. I have actually personally been involved with about 12 startups in Pakistan, and I do know I'm actually quite impressed by the technological quality of startups coming out of Pakistan. And I'm thinking that they must be sitting there and saying, no, look, I want to be able to create a big company that can go public on NASDAQ. I want to make money. I want to be prosperous, globally. I want to be having resources to be a globally free human being. Now, do you think that that's where some bulk of Pakistani establishment might be wanting to head?
Yeah, I mean, I can say that this has been so for the last almost from President Musharraf's time to through Zardari, through Nawaz, everybody's been wanting the same thing, what you just mentioned. You must have heard this so many times that, now Imran Khan's, now the mantra is that, we have shifted from geostrategy to geoeconomics. All the time they all the time constantly saying,
Correct.
we had the Pakistani National Security Advisor, Mueed Yusuf, coming here saying all this, that we are shifting to geoeconomics, we want to do this. Now, and that's where the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor was a big shift in the sense, almost 6, 7, 8 years back, that, hey, your geographical space has been used for geopolitical renting for military security purposes and by others. In the Cold War, the Americans used against the Soviet, then you used against the Indians and Afghans, and then again the Americans came as counter-terror cooperation. Enough of your soil being used for security purposes alone. We have lost the geoeconomic part, So if at all you have to do those geopolitical renting, that you rent them and they throw you money and your economy runs like that, now begin to realize that that is not the way that structured economies can actually function.
Right. Yeah.
And in the 21st century, connectivity is the only way to do so.
Absolutely.
And I tell you, I'm not defending Pakistan. I'm saying what I'm aware of.
No, I think. Yeah.
And so the idea has been germinating in both, and not just Pakistan, India as well, without connectivity. Now, if you want to talk geopolitics, we haven't even talked about it as yet. We lost in Afghanistan. That's what happened.
Yes. Yeah.
The idea of connectivity has been existing from the time of Prime Minister Vajpayee.
Right.
In the 1990s. And Nawaz Sharif as Prime Minister. Then Pervez Musharraf and Vajpayee and Pervez Musharraf and Manmohan Singh. I continued to the idea. I still remember Manmohan Singh's very famous quote. He said, I'd love to see a day in my lifetime when I have breakfast in Delhi, a lunch in Islamabad, and dinner in Kabul. Now, that's exactly what would. So the current establishment, and I know them closely to the extent that, they tried, it was kind of unfortunate. You may not like this, but they tried to reach out to the Modi government, and they were rebuffed, and so they try to use other signals like Kartarpur opening that, look, I mean, we are not quite like the way we are. We don't want to be like that. So help us.
So, but do you think, Professor Khan, do you think that that's really genuine? Because if so, I think those of us who are sitting in the diaspora could make a difference. But do you really believe that that could be the internal, that's the authentic, genuine, sort of a feeling and emotion in Pakistan, that let's create, an EU-like entity which spans South Asia and creates a zone of peace with everybody having their own, this could become a win-win scenario where we are, if we are focusing on prosperity, on economic prosperity, right? That could be a starting point where we are saying we are not dependent on outside forces. Because I know that Pakistan has definitely reached out to the Modi government. I actually think that the Modi government has an opportunity right now to actually kind of start making some inroads, at least in the technological front, which I've been trying to do in my own way. And we do have a lot of programmers in Karachi who work for companies in Bangalore, Bangalore engineers working for startups in Karachi. And this may be under the radar of the state, but it's happening.
If you ask a common average person in India or Pakistan, and I've been interacting for 2 years, 20 years now. I know that that's what people want.
Yes, yeah.
The problem is bigger problem is that it's India-Pakistan rivalry has now you've kept people to people away. You've snapped off cultural connections. You've snapped off all these kind of. You're not playing cricket. You're not doing acting. Pakistani artists are thrown out of Bollywood. You don't want to send cricket matches. You're burning down mosques. You're burning down temples. What kind of an atmosphere we have created in the process?
I know. It's terrible.
It's so because... it's so. Under these circumstances, and then then we come with comes to the politics of it. Obviously, we're talking about the monumental changes that are happening. China is not the same China that was 30 years ago. It's now moving out from its group. China is moving into its third phase. They have done those consolidation. Now they are getting into external influence. Now, all countries, not just Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, or Nepal, all surrounding countries with India. India is rising in its own way. We know that, how India is rising. But India also have a lot of problems. The immediate problem within India does not affect China across. It's the geopolitical India that affects China. But, if there is a Sikh insurgency that affects Pakistan, if there is that local problem immediately affects each other, Kashmir, Sikhs, crackdown. So India's domestic policy will affect the region. What happened in Tamil and Sri Lanka, what happened in Sikhs and Pakistan, Kashmir and Pakistan, you can have that in Bangladesh and other parts. So it's very localized region. And, and regional integration, failure of regional integration in South Asia is primarily because of India-Pakistan rivalry. Every basic student knows that.
Do you think, Professor Khan, that geoeconomics or our mutual desire for prosperity, for economic prosperity, could ever trump the Kashmir issue? Could it ever trump?
It will trump. It can trump. But I'll tell you why. I'm speaking now very frankly now. As long as both Islamabad and New Delhi keep on listening to their strategic security enclaves, this is the desire that will not reach fruition, because those forces have reasons not to allow that to happen.
Correct. That's true. I mean, listen,
somebody's enterprise is going to be destroyed in order for other enterprise to be created.
Completely.
It's as simple as that. That's the reason,
But okay, so let's say in India, if we had peace with Pakistan, let's say, who are the people who would be opposing that? In my view, I think the guys who would be opposing that in India are probably the forces of division within India, right? Those who want to sort of create an enemy state. It is there. Let's just pump some money into this. This is going to buy us some votes. So that, I think, that could be that could be the constituency there. In Pakistan, do you think that the military will be served if it made some economic ties with India? Would the military be hurt? I mean, because military also needs a reason to be alive, right?
No.
Doesn't it need an enemy?
No. Yeah, I mean, but militaries don't create the enemies. I mean, see, both countries act in a certain way that it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. They both countries have made those enemy images of each other for so long,
right,
that you expect that overnight or through a clever method it's going to happen. It won't. You have to have patience, and you have to have a very evolutionary process to get that going on. And that is the economic and other connectivity is not an overnight process. It's a process that started. Know that. No, but it's you have to make a start on those things.
I agree.
I mean, you have to make a like most favored nation status, and then you have to do cross-border trade. Now, what you're doing secretly cross-border trade, these border security forces, they let this thing go in there. Some wheat comes in, some tomatoes go here. These silly little things, and sometimes you do it via Dubai and other things. Everyone knows what those problems are.
Yes.
So they don't do it. So you want to identify the forces. There's a term that was used by the current Indian foreign minister. He can define it much more. He used that, we are stuck by something called the Delhi dogma. Dogma of Delhi. There is also a dogma of Islamabad, by the way. You are stuck into certain fixated positions on that this is the gospel security paradigm that cannot be shaken or broken. And you cannot bypass those rigid fixated thinking,
In
And
your
this is not just Asha, this is not just the forces that you are identifying, you kind of right-wing divisive forces.
right.
Similar kind of mindset also exists on Pakistan side as well. It's
In
about, so because the Pakistani system is so military dominated, so a lot matters, I mean, now the current military really try to reach out. Every rapprochement that has happened or initiative towards could not happen in Pakistan without the nod from army headquarters.
true,
When Musharraf was reaching out to Agra and other places, he was the chief himself.
right,
It
yeah,
did not go anywhere. It
true,
was the other side that derailed it. And then
right.
when Vajpayee and all came, this was suddenly, and then what happened with Modi? Modi's tried to do it with Nawaz Sharif. What happened? That wasn't really a nice way to do it. You secretly start meeting the prime minister, then try to enter into, the granddaughter's wedding. And then it's a structural problem between India and Pakistan are so deep rooted. You cannot be clever about this. You have to be much more grind and straighter about it to
I,
bring all stakeholders on board.
true,
That's how
true.
things have to be
But
done.
I have a feeling, though, Professor Khan, I have a feeling that that trip that Modi made for Nawaz Sharif's granddaughter's wedding, I think that was genuinely a trip that he tried to kickstart a sort of a process where maybe people would say, okay, you know what, we are one people. And that this ultimately, unless we collaborate and cooperate, we are not looking at a bright future. I think he wanted to do that, but if you remember, I think it really upset a lot of people in Pakistan, especially I think in the establishment. And remember, there was an attack right away, right? Literally, the days after Modi left Lahore.
Within a week, there was an attack and across the border.
Where was that attack, by the way? Do you remember?
Pathankot Air Base.
Pathankot, yeah, Pathankot happened. Now that I think was an immediate, sort of a signal from the army saying, don't bypass us. Don't go directly to Nawaz Sharif. You should be going through the whole establishment after Modi's visit. So I think it will have to be. I think it will have to be across the board buy-in from all stakeholders in Pakistan and India to say that, look, there is a possibility. We are leaving money on the table. If you ask me, I mean, as a venture capitalist, I'm focusing right now strictly on returns on investment. I actually think we are leaving so much money on the table, given how much talent we have in both the countries. If we collaborated, we would be giving EU a run for the money. I mean, EU would not compare to kind of value we would be generating as a South Asian bloc between India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh alone. And I just feel that if there was a buy-in, which actually leads me to the next question. So, Professor Khan, in your view, let's do a thought experiment that 30 years from now, sort of a mysterious outside, group of, let's say, diplomats without borders. Okay, let's say diplomats without borders, people like you, me, and 50 other people from across US, across India and Pakistan who think similar. Okay, who say we want to really focus on prosperity right now and peace. Let's say there is this mysterious body that succeeds 30, fast forward to year 2050. And we are looking back and saying, okay, we pulled it off. There is now an EU-like entity in South Asia, and it is minting money. It's doing fantastic in the global marketplace. What would that mysterious or invisible or whatever what would that entity look like? Let's say it's a group of 50, 60 stakeholders / people. Of course, this will have to be done by people, not just organizations. So if there are those like-minded people, 50, let's say, 50 to 100, let's say, what would those kind of people look like who in 2050 will be able to say, we managed to achieve this dream? What would it look like?
My expertise is limited in this particular way, but I can only say that it cannot happen in the kind of atmosphere that is existing in the region itself.
Right.
There's so many restrictions of people, and within the region, it has to be that these people-to-people contact has to start.
Okay.
This only. But these restrictions are not bounded. That's my only. I don't know how it will happen, but I can give an idea since you asked. It can happen here. It can happen here, where the Indian and Pakistani diasporas are, UK, here, Middle East. I have to say this rather sadly. You and I can talk as friends. We're more enlightened people, so we don't care about these things. But even here, I sense, I've been here for 20 years in California now. There are enclaves. previously, Indian Pakistani used to be all desis together.
Right.
Now you have their own, you move in your own communities.
That is so true. That's
and you
so
have
true.
your own little politics. You don't cross-pollinate and discuss with each other, And even here, the entrepreneurs, they have their own little thing,
Yes. Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you want to start, you just have to start here.
Yes.
When you have your startups and your entrepreneurs here, when you become here, suddenly you realize that, there's a joint thing in California, the Silicon Valley. It'll become very hard for Delhi or Bangalore or Karachi or Islamabad to refuse.
Yes.
That's the only way you can break the ice. Say, look,
I actually did meet. I tried bringing up this topic with some friends in New York. Do you know Marina and Shaukat? He used to be Shaukat. I think used to be a UN ambassador or something from Pakistan in New York, and now Marina and Shaukat are based in New York. He's retired now, but he used to be an ambassador, I think, at one point to the UN. I asked him, I said, Shaukat, what would it take we are sitting here right now in your house, we are enjoying some fantastic biryani and great firni and this and that now. What do you think? Why do you think that people like you and me and 50 others cannot collaborate to say, let's bring our own weight onto the Indian and Pakistani systems and say this is, and really work on it. Yes, it's going to take many years, but let's start working on it. He said, well, first Kashmir issue has to be resolved. Now, I guess that is something that is very close to the hearts of many Pakistanis. How does one sidestep that issue? Because I think on the Indian side, if somebody like me went to Delhi and said, and I, by the way, just so you know, I'm actually in the good books of Modi government. They love my family. My mama used to be in the old Jansang and RSS and BJP, big time BJP, and now my mama's daughter is now the treasurer for BJP. So they just love this whole Chudasama family. And I think as a result, they have good feelings about me because I try to do all kinds of venture stuff in India. But if I were to go into the Modi, the inner circle and say, Dekho, Kashmir mein plebiscite hone do, jaane do Kashmir ko. If any of us, heavens forbid, said that, it would be over. We would be immediately cast out as saying, you are anti-national. So the Kashmir issue is huge right now. And it's an elephant in the room. And I have no idea how any of us from outside will be able to surpass. I feel that, look, if Kashmiris want their own country, they should be given this country. I don't know. But I think India and Pakistan, both sides, I don't think that people there, the intelligentsia there, is interested in even discussing this matter. Both feel that it's that it belongs to them.
Well, there are always three solutions to a problem, and out of those three, one is always never going to happen, and one is the most likely one that has happened, and that becomes a very hopeful future, and then there's always a middle one. So in every problem that you see, whether it's Afghanistan, Kashmir, India, Pakistan, India, China, everywhere there are always three. I'll give you the three.
Okay.
So one that is the future that's not going to happen is neither can India take the Pakistan Kashmir nor can Pakistan take the India Kashmir. It will never be united again in the same way as it existed as an independent Kashmir or whatever name in either country. That will not happen in any attempt to do. That's one thing.
Are you referring to Azad Kashmir? That will
you call Azad Kashmir or whichever you want to, POK, IOK, all those names.
Right.
Neither side can get the other side now.
Yes.
So that future that you can get is gone.
Right.
The other future is that both sides agree. If that doesn't happen, then you say this is the status quo. This is the line of control. This is it. This is the fate of history. It's it. Stop the suffering of the people of Kashmir.
Right.
That's one. And the third one was what Manmohan Singh and Musharraf tried to do, that, okay, just agree to disagree and just leave it like that, freeze it for 15, 20 years on status quo, ease up the people, stop this drama.
Right.
And then we will pick this up after 20 years. In the meantime, let's do the trade and other things.
Right. Right.
This was nearly agreed. but at the time,
Mm-hmm.
when this happened.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, and Musharraf was out of the office, and then other people came and they had different agendas, and things really moved in a different directions now. So now, this school of thought that you were referring to the ambassador, and he said, let's solve the Kashmir issue. Now, this point, and there's another Delhi school of thought how to deal with this issue.
Okay.
Pakistan issue is Kashmir first and then the rest.
Right.
That's not going to happen because I've given you the possibility. The only way is to unlock is to that either you agree now that this is the line of control is the border and that's it.
Right.
Or you agree, if you don't agree on that because of domestic politics, then you agree to say, oh, let's put it on the freeze and stop this nonsense.
Okay.
Let's that not become the problem, and we've got many other things to discuss.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's where we have a scope of doing anything that you and I are talking about
Mm-hmm.
in terms of economic integration and other things can happen and Kashmir can be done.
Right.
Let's not bring that into the mainstream. So that's the only way happen.
Mm-hmm.
But the current government, and since your treasurer policy is to isolate Pakistan because of this policy of, and it's Kashmir related essentially. It's not anything else related. It is Kashmir related. Let's talk straight away. Modi government is punishing Pakistan and isolating Pakistan and snapping all this cultural and cricket and other things because of Pakistan Kashmir policy. Right?
Correct. Yeah.
So Kashmir becomes a problem on both ends. They will be unable to isolate Pakistan, and the Pakistan will be unable to keep this idea that Kashmir first and then do the rest. They will suffer in the process. Both will suffer in the process.
True.
This is what I was calling the dogma. The regional dogma. You have to break that, and the only way it can be broken out because we're not involved in that emotions here. We have to move out of that emotions here.
I know.
Only then we can move forward.
True. So true.
Because and then we sit down and say, hey, if you and I talk like that, you know how people in Islamabad and Delhi say, oh, because you're sitting in America, you can talk like that.
Right. But we should tell them that this is what we are talking like this because I think it's in the interest of peace and future that we should be talking dispassionately about this and thinking of problem solving rather than because these days technology is allowing people to. Have you tried using Clubhouse, Professor Khan?
No.
It's a very interesting new app, and I find tons of young Pakistanis and Indians on it now every day, and they're discussing these things in very civilized manner, actually, which I've never seen before. So it's an interesting, sort of a platform where people are talking about these things now, and they're completely independently. They're just there because it's a social media platform and it's available to everybody. But I think that said, these are very, very important and interesting points that we will talk about. We'll probably.
Yeah, we can have other session also. Asha, I'm sorry, I've got some guests waiting downstairs.
No, absolutely. No problem. No problem.
So we can talk more about this, but there are a lot more geopolitical changes happening. There was a China-India problem. There's India-Pakistan problem. This really is a huge Pandora box to talk a lot more.
No, we will. We'll continue.
By the way, let me admire your background. This is your sitting room, and it's so lovely.
Oh, thank you.
And we should. come down to Monterey someday, or I can drive up there. You're all vaccinated, so
No, absolutely. And in fact, I'll reach out. In fact, you should. I know is your daughter there now, or is or all three of you come? I mean, you tell me when is a good time, and I'll make sure that I invite Iram and family also, and we can do something fun together.
Yeah. You can do that. We can always come here. My daughter is here. Grandson is here. They're all here.
Okay.
But they all are. The scheduling is always an issue. So, but we can always do that.
We'll figure something out in the next few weeks. For sure. And thank you so much for joining us today, giving us your time. And this is the best. I think this is a best way to go forward now. For all of us to be having these conversations. So.
Yeah. Because if we keep talking, go back in the region, the moment you land there, it looks like a very different world to me, at least. They talk very differently. Even though we can talk on Skype, another thing these days, you don't have to be physically there. COVID days, we've only been talking on Zooms and others, but even then we realize that that's very different way of analyzing things and factoring, why we cannot do. There is little spirit out there what we can do, and more discussion on why we cannot do. So unless that emphasis changes as to what can be done, rather than why it cannot be done,
Yes,
Unless that conversation paradigm changes, we're
true.
not going to go anywhere. We're just going to go circles and talking around.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, on that note, we'll probably have that conversation around a can do. What is it that we can do and we can achieve? And maybe I'll set up another call, a Zoom call also. But thank you so much for your time, and wishing you a beautiful Sunday evening. And I hope I didn't delay you too much from your dinner. So
No, I'm supposed to barbecue downstairs. There are people waiting for me to barbecue.
okay. Well, enjoy your dinner, Professor Khan. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.